I'm going to run this video to show how some simple jigs and a router can add interesting detail to millwork. Creating it takes a little bit of effort to plan, but once this fixture is made, it's very simple and works for repetitive carving of millwork. The fixture has an indexing block to position the lamb's tongue on the end of the beam, and it's set to hold the roller guide the right distance down from the surface for guiding the bearing. Once the jig is in position, it's just a matter of routing the edge. In this case, the wood is hard maple. I'm taking a very large pass with this 45-degree bevel. So I did a little climb cutting to pre-mill the corner off so it didn't chip. And then with a final pass, I get a nice, smooth, virtually stain-ready surface. This is the rough profile of the lamb's tongue, and I'll use two other fixtures to notch it before I do the hand carving on the surface to add the final detail to the profile. Another close-up of the routing fixture shows the contour that the bearing follows, and then the index block that I've glued on the end. This sets it, in this case, 17 inches from the end of the beam to the start of the leaf or the lamb's tongue. Because I made the jig universal, I can use just flip it over to do the other end of the beam. This indexes the fixture to the end of the beam here. Again, I'll do some climb cutting to remove stock from this sharp corner and the hard maple so it doesn't chip off for the final pass. With the preliminary routing done on these corners, I'll move on to the next step with a smaller router, another fixture to put a notch into the beam detail. The jig is positioned so that the center of this V is lined up with the center of the little hump. I'll clean up these little inconsistencies with a piece of sandpaper on a round sanding block. And the last step is to clean up the bottom of the little V groove with a really sharp chisel. To get a nice crisp detail. So the next step is to route a small shoulder across here. And I want the shoulder to be 4 1/4 inches from the very tip of that tongue there. So I made a quick little gauge block to mark. This gives me a reference for setting up the router fixture. I'll mark the other side at the same time. And this is the fixture I have for routing this shoulder. Just a V block with a couple of guides to stabilize it. And looking close, you can see a tip of a screw here run through the pattern. That screw protrudes just enough to stick into the wood here so my jig doesn't slide while using the router. The router is set up with a flush trim bit, and the distance from this plate to the router bit is about a 32nd of an inch shy of this surface here. It'll leave a little bit of extra material to work with in the carving step. Now with this shoulder routed, I'm ready to go to the next step, which is going to be to carve the roll on the end of the limestone. Got a combination square set up here to continue that bevel mark. And then I draw an approximate outline of the curve of the roll. Give myself an index mark, square to these edges to line up my chisel. Start with the chisel in this direction, following that line, flip it over. And that gives a good curve for the start of this filing process. When I set up the router, I try to keep the bit from going below this surface, so there's a little extra material here that protects when I'm doing this filing process. And I've seen other lamb's tongues before, and they stop with that shoulder coming square in. I like to put a little tuck under there, give it a little more detail, make it look like more of a curve. I start out with a triangle file and then take a few passes with a pointed laminate file to make a nice tight little roll. All this time I'm making an effort not to damage this surface. And because this is hard maple, I'm using these files. You can probably do it with sandpaper on other materials. I'm just going to take a little bit off of this extra material here. And then take the last few little scrape marks out with a scraper. Final lick in there, and then that part's ready for sandpaper. Let the sandpaper protrude from the edge of the block so it gets into that fold a little bit. The rest of the beam will get more sanding before the stain, but because it's maple, this has to be pretty pristine. Otherwise, any tooling marks will show up in the staining process. The main reason I began this process with a router and measurements is to get these consistent. I've got to do 16 of this pattern on the beams themselves, and on the crown filler piece there was another 20, so I had to do a total of 36 of these. So I didn't carve them all by hand. If I was just doing 2 or 3 or 4, I would have just drawn them out and then chiseled the whole works. Because I have to do so many, I wanted to come up with a process to streamline and make them consistent.